So, welcome to my wrap-up for the month of August. I can't even believe that. I keep saying that I am moving into October. Like, I'm just skipping September. I'm not skipping September. In fact, I've already filmed my TBR, but I haven't put it up yet. I've filmed my TBR for September. So September exists, but for whatever reason, I keep forgetting that, and I keep going straight from August to October, and I have to like mentally go through in my mind what month is coming next. Anyway, all of that to say, welcome to my August wrap-up. I am really excited about a lot of these books that I read. I'm gonna start with two that I predict are gonna be 5-star reads, but I will finish one today at some point after filming this, and I will probably carry the other one into what month? September. So I probably will carry this into September because I still have a good chunk left to read of this one. But this is How to Talk to a Goddess and Other Lessons in Real Magic, and I'm really enjoying it. I'm just reading it slower. I always read high fantasy slower. This is How to Talk to a Goddess and Other Lessons in Real Magic by Emily Corey Barker. This is the second book. It's the sequel to The Thinking Woman's Guide to Real Magic, which I love, and I am really enjoying this. It is interesting. I won't say too much because I'll put it in the September wrap-up, but it is interesting that I feel like I'm reading a completely different author. It is the same author, but if you've watched a few of my past videos where I've been anticipating this, you'll notice it's been quite a long time, almost a decade in between, or maybe even, has it been 11 years? It's been a long time in between books with nothing else written. And so I kind of feel like the author who writes like non-fiction at the court stuff, I think, legal. Yeah, she's a career covering the legal field. So she's still writing, but she writes something very, very different from high fantasy. And it just feels like a completely different book in a lot of ways. It's following the same format, and they're all the same characters. But I've been struggling to put my finger on it. What exactly is it that has changed about her voice? And I think that it's just kind of like a loss of wonder. Like things are clever, but not surprising. Whereas before, they were a little bit messy. The whole story was kind of sloppy and weird, but that made it wonderful. It was a little non sequitur, but that made it wonderful. And in the end, it all kind of came together in this big cliffhanger. And now I think it came together in that big cliffhanger because she didn't know what to do with all the strings that she had brought to this tapestry. And here, it's just very, very clean. It's very clean. It's very point A to point B. Yeah, the only word I can think of is clever. It's clever. The other one wasn't clever. It was inventive. I know there's a subtle line, but it's just interesting. It's interesting because it feels like I'm reading the same story written by not the same story. It's a different story about the same people, but like it feels like I'm reading one continuous story because this just immediately picks up where the other one left off. So it feels like one continuous story that was written by two different authors. Like one wrote part A and one wrote part B, but it's the same author. So that's interesting. But I still do think that this will be a 5-star read, just not for the same reasons that the first one was a 5-star read, which is kind of funny. And then this one I will finish today. This one I am almost done with, and I'm absolutely loving this. So I'm going to count this in my August wrap up. So this is my first 5-star read that I'll talk to you about. This book is so much fun. It is a YA. This is The Poison Heart by Callan Bayron. I might be saying that wrong. This is the person who wrote Cinderella is Dead, which has gotten a lot of, it's been on all the bookish social media. But this was a newer one that came out a few months ago. It came out fact, I got it like 2 days. I pre-ordered it, and I think it arrived 2 days or so before I was moving. So July, end of June, early July. And I finally had the time to pick it up and was pleasantly surprised by how very readable this is. Yeah, it's just really great, and it's making me think about Macbeth. It is not about Macbeth. It's about a poison garden. It's about a girl with powers. It's about family relationships and dynamics. It's about Greek mythology. It's about Secret Garden. It's about a lot of different things, but the naming of some of the characters, I don't want to give anything away, so I'm thinking through, how do I say this how do I make the connection for you without giving anything away? The naming of certain characters and the meaning associated with them and their personality, I don't know if you can hear those big trucks, is really interesting to me, and it's making me think of Macbeth. So there's a character in here named Hecate, or Hecate. I'm never sure how to say it, but I always say it Hecate. Hecate, which is a figure in Greek mythology, paired with lots of different other characters. Medea is mentioned, and the relationship between Hecate and Medea is interesting in both the book and in Greek mythology. Medea is obviously not in Macbeth, but Hecate is, as are the three witches, which are usually portrayed and seen as the hag, that, you know, these usually seen as the three like stages of womanhood and other things having to do with three. Well, in here it makes the connection between Medea having the woman with three faces. And that just made me think of the three witches in Macbeth, especially with Hecate kind of being the embodiment of the woman with three faces. Not three physical faces, but like three sides. And then making the connection, because I've always taught Macbeth as Lady Macbeth being the fourth witch, and how that kind of changes all the dynamics of everything. And so there's a lot of things in here that kind of point to that as well, without ever talking about Macbeth. I don't think she means to make any connections to Macbeth, but because they share this Greek mythology in common, it had me thinking about Macbeth like crazy. So that was a really fun added feature for me. So on its own, it's an amazing story, really super fun. I'm excited to see how it ends. I have some guesses. I don't think it's going to shock me in any way, but the ride was really fun, and I recommend this one. Alone Time was another 5-star read. This is a non-fiction. 4 Seasons, 4 Cities, and the Pleasures of Solitude by Stephanie Rosenblum. I read this one because I haven't gotten to travel overseas in a really long time. I should have, on my rhythm, I should have gone this summer. But of course, obviously, couldn't. I mean, I guess I could have gone somewhere. I have friends who went to Iceland and stuff, but it wasn't going to happen. I'm not going to do that right now. But anyway, side note. I read several books that were hopefully to help kind of alleviate that desire to travel, and or help me feel like I got to go somewhere. And this was great. This was wonderful. It is about a woman traveling alone, but it's not like a guidebook for a woman traveling alone. It's just about this woman's experience in these 4 distinct cities. And what I loved about it was that I had spent significant amount of time in one of them. She goes to Paris, Istanbul, Florence, and New York. And I have spent time in Paris alone as a female traveler, as an independent female traveler, and I could really relate to her experience, really relate to her experience. It felt very, very similar to my own. And so that made me extremely trusting of her descriptions of these other places that I haven't been or haven't spent a significant amount of time in. And it reiterated for me the kind of gut feeling I've always had that I probably wouldn't be super interested in going to Turkey. I don't know why. I've just never been interested in Turkey or that kind of area or culture. Reading this was interesting, but again, didn't feel like, ooh, I really want to go there. But Florence, which sounds like it was quite a difficult experience for her, I was like, ooh, I really want to go to Florence. So it was great. It was fun. It was wonderful. I loved her tone. I loved the way she spoke. And I really, really trusted her because what she wrote about her experience in Paris was very similar to my own. And I could really envision what she was talking about because it was, it might have been my own memory So it was awesome. This is one of my new favorites of the year. This is Ms. Hargreaves by Frank Baker. This was recommended to me as one of 3 reads that I read this month to try and match the glory that was Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day. So the librarian suggested multiple reads for many books, and she suggested 4 or 5 for Miss Pettigrew, and I picked 3 of them to try to read because I really wanted to recreate that. And this is one of them, and as you can see, it's a 5-star read for me. It is so weird and wonderful and delightful. Basically, so it's written in 1940, and basically, there's these 2 friends. They're on a vacation, and they visit a church, and they're bored, and so they start to banter back and forth and kind of, it's a big game of yes and. So one of them mentions this woman that they know who knows the vicar of the church. They don't really know this woman. She doesn't even exist. They name her Miss Hargreaves. They give her personality. They give her a location. They put her in a hotel in Bath. And it's just like they just create this whole relationship with her. And they're just doing it back and forth banter because they're bored and they're unhappy and they're uncomfortable and they're done with their vacation and they're just having a fun conversation. I have these kinds of conversations with my sister all the time. All the time. They just happen. You don't plan them. You don't think about them. You just pick up whatever weird thing the person said before and you run with it, right? The only thing is that Miss Hargreaves comes to life, shows up, and starts to take over and become super powerful the life of one of these characters, and he doesn't know what to do. He's torn. It's a little bit of a Frankenstein story too. She's his monster, but he might end up being a better Frankenstein than the doctor, although he has the same struggle. It's such an interesting book. It could also be taken maybe as a morality tale about lies and how they get away from you. But mostly it's just this really weird magical realism, surreal kind of Dada, it's Dada-esque story, which you could give it meaning, but you're making that meaning. Really, it's just a story. And my favorite character in here is the father. He's glorious. He's absolutely wonderful. I highly recommend this book. Another that was recommended to me by the librarian. This one because I said that I loved New Girl in Little Cove, which is a more recent book, which you should get your hands on too. Set in Newfoundland. It's historical fiction, but it's not too far back. It's set in the 1980s, 1990s, about a girl who goes from Canada, mainland Canada, to Newfoundland and teaches there. And I really loved this book. I really loved it. And so I told the librarian that, and I said I'd love something else set in Newfoundland. And I was suggested Our Homesick Songs by Emma Hooper. And this book blew me out of the water. It was so good. This may be one of my favorite books of all time now, not just one of my favorite books of the month or even the year. This is so beautiful. It says lyrical up here at the top here. Lyrical, the town is filled with magic and so is Hooper's writing. Yes. This is the story of a town. It's the story of a family. It's the story of being lost and found. It is the story of survival and risk. It is the story of just kind of keeping afloat. It's heartbreaking and inspiring and beautiful and wonderful and dark and light. It's everything, and I was so sad when it ended. But I really want you to read this book. I want everybody to read this book. It was so beautiful. And I do strongly recommend that you read it because you're going to want to underline things. But also, simultaneously, listen to it because you're going to want to hear the songs being sung. This one was so much fun. This was one that I read for travel. This is Raven Master, My Life with the Ravens at the Tower of London by Christopher Scaife. And I've been obsessed with crows for a really long time. They're so smart and their memories are so long, and it fascinates me to watch them. Like, they're just underestimated creatures. When I went to London, I was really excited to go to see, I didn't want to go see the crown jewels. In fact, I didn't. There was a huge long line. I was like, it'd be interesting, but no, not doing that. What I was really interested in was the tower, like where the boys had been kept and where Lady Jane Grey had been kept, things like that. I wanted to see that stuff. But what I really wanted to see was the ravens. And this is the man who's in charge of all of the men who are in charge of looking after the ravens. And what was really fun for me at the beginning was reading how much he loved the ravens and how he knows all their personalities. And there's a list in here of like their identifying bracelet. And so I went through my old photos from my time in London in 2016, summer of 2016, and was excited to find out like which ones had I seen, because all the ones that he's writing about in this book are the ones that would have been there when I was there. So it was really fun. I got to see like which ones I had seen. I'd only seen 3 of the, I think 6 or 7. 6, because they're in pairs. This was a wonderful book. I chose to read this as a nod to one of my favorite books of all time, which is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Speaking of Frankenstein, when I talked about Miss Hargreaves, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is one of my very favorite stories. And I keep saying Mary Shelley's Frankenstein because I don't mean like the guy with bolts in his neck and, you know, the TV Frankenstein. I don't mean the monsters, although the monsters are fun. I mean Mary Shelley's Dr. Frankenstein and his monster, and how the monster is just as much of a protagonist as Dr. Frankenstein, if not more so. In fact, Dr. Frankenstein is kind of the antagonist in that whole story. And that gets flipped in Hollywood. So I loved this. I loved a lot of things about this. It's another YA, which is what really surprised me. My love for it. But what I loved about this was the working in, the superimposing of history with the fiction, and putting Mary and Percy Shelley in the story. I'm not going to ruin anything for you because I think going into this pretty blind is the way to go. This is not the story of Frankenstein as you know it, but this is a story of life and death and rebirth. There are monsters and there are creators, and it's just really great. It's really great. Highly recommend this. So those are my 5-star reads. That's a lot of 5-star reads. Now for my 4 stars. First on that 4-star list, we've got Good Neighbors by Sarah Langan. Now, I picked this up because it was, just like it says here, modern day Crucible. It was supposed to be a nod to the Crucible, which is one of my favorite stories of all time. And while I can understand why that is a comparison that's made, I think it's just more of a nod to witch hunts in general. Like that whole choose someone who's weaker and different and make them the villain so that we can be villainous. We see that story over and over and over again, and that's what this is. It's not really about the Crucible or a nod to the Crucible. It's really just a nod to witch hunts in general. And the Crucible is not the first witch hunt story. So it's interesting that they made that connection. At first I was reading it and I was like, what on earth is this? Like, it's written... It takes place in the future. It's written through a series of like narrative, like third-person narrative that you would read, but also first-person narrative. Also like court documents and newspaper articles and text feeds and just all sorts of ways to tell this story. And like maps and just all sorts of things. Like there's from the very beginning, there's a running list of like the population of the street and how that changes through the course of this book, where people die and get killed and disappear and fall down sinkholes. It's the near future. The world is ending. Climate is a big part of this. Trigger warnings for abuse and just generalized anxiety It's anxiety inducing. I couldn't look away, and I was like, this is not the kind of book that I normally read, and I am not, like, this is not enjoyable for me, but I couldn't look away. And then in the end, it became phenomenal for me. So I think because it was such a rough book to read, the subject matter was harsh. I'm leaving it at 4 stars, but this very well could be a 5-star for somebody. This was one of the best climate change thrillers I've ever read, and I didn't even know that's what I was getting when I went into this, but that's what it is. And yeah, it was very well done. I chose to read The Flight of Gemma Hardy by Margot Livesey. I chose to read this as a nod to Jane Eyre, which is one of my favorite books of all time, possibly my favorite book of all time. And this was super, super fun. There are no women hidden in any attics. There's no superhero or super anti-hero. All the characters are made very human. A huge chunk of this is spent in the time when Gemma in this, but Jane, would have been at school. This is set in the 1950s, and I don't know, it had enough of the feel of Jane Eyre to reward the reader who knows Jane Eyre well by going, oh, I know what part of the book this is. But it was original enough to stand on its own. Somebody could read this and have no clue about the story of Jane Eyre and just really love this. Very well written. It's great storytelling. But for the person who knows Jane Eyre and picks this up because it is a retelling of Jane Eyre, I think you're going to really love it. Because yes, like I said, you can read it and you can be like, oh, I know what event in the book we're at right now. I can recognize enough of that to know, or I know who that's supposed to be. But there are enough characters in here that aren't in Jane Eyre, and there are enough events in here that are unique to this book, and there are enough motives and inner dialogue that's gone through in this book that is not in Jane Eyre at all. The psychology is really dealt with here. Why did certain characters behave the way they behaved? Why were certain circumstances unavoidable? Characters, I love Jane Eyre, but the characters in this book are much more well-rounded. They're not caricatures, whereas in Jane Eyre they really are. They're types. They're all types, and they're all archetypes in Jane Eyre. And in this, they're all people. Highly recommend The Flight of Gemma Hardy. It's a great retelling. Then I read The Lost Art of Keeping Secrets by Ava Rice. This is Tim Rice's daughter. So Tim Rice, the lyricist, Tim Rice of Lion King fame and all of that. This is his daughter. And I don't think this is her debut novel, but it's the first novel I've read by her. And I read this because it was recommended to me by that librarian, and I read this because it was recommended for Miss Pettigrew. And I don't think that it's anything like Miss Pettigrew. I understand why that connection was made. I did give this 4 stars, but completely on its own account. This it felt more like a Nancy Mitford book to me, or maybe a British Great Gatsby, something like that, than it felt like Miss Pettigrew. Miss Pettigrew, at its very heart, is a lightness of being, even though some dark, heavy things happen. This, at its very heart, is a darkness of being, even though very light things happen. So it's it's the opposite. It's very well written. This author has grown up surrounded by words and how to use them very skillfully. And her storytelling is great, and I really did enjoy this. I gave it 4 stars for what it is, but it was not a great, if you love Miss Pettigrew, then read this. No. But I got Miss Hargreaves, so that's fine with me. I'm not upset about that. I don't think that I would ever want to read this again. So for that reason, even though it's a 4 star and even though I enjoyed it, I'm going to unhaul this one. I read The Necklace. I read this because I wanted something that would nod at my favorite, one of my favorite books, which was The Great Gatsby. And I read this because it presented this premise of like, what if the Buchanan's grandchildren had to answer for all they did in The Great Gatsby? Well, this is not exactly that. This is a story in its own right. Why I loved this. I gave this 4 stars because A, it was super readable. I read it in one day and I did not intend to. Claire Macmillan has written a lot of things. This is an older book. It's from 2000 and... Oh, it's not that old. It's from 2017. I don't know that she's written a lot, if anything else at all. I don't know. But I really loved this because I was totally taken by surprise because it centers around a necklace from northern India and how it came into the family and why it wasn't in a will and who it belongs to now and what it's worth and where it came from and how did they get it and should they give it back to somebody in particular? Like, does it belong back in India? Like, it was centered around this necklace. Well, duh, it's called The Necklace. But I didn't know anything about a necklace from the synopsis. And yes, there is that, like, it takes place in 2 time periods and different generations in the same family. And there is that Roaring 20s storyline, which brings the necklace into our attention. But what I really loved about it was not necessarily that aspect of the story which drew me to it in the first place of The Great Gatsby, but this necklace. And I don't want to say anything else because I don't want to give any spoilers. I really think that part of my delight with this book was being surprised, was not getting what I bargained for, but getting something better. And so I would like you to have that gift as well. Another 4-star, which kind of surprised me, was The Bright and Breaking Sea by Chloe Neal. I don't normally pick up swashbuckling pirate adventures, but I loved this one. I picked it up because it was a cheap one on Book Outlet, and I think I needed to like fill a cart for free shipping or something. So I got this one, and I've had it for a while now, and I'm so glad that I got it because it was really fun and it hit the perfect spot for me right now in August at the end of the summer. It was just exactly what I needed. It is a fantasy, but the fantasy is pretty minimal. It takes place in an alternate Regency England. There's Queen on the throne, and there's a kind of magic that they speak of as like an alignment. And Kit Harington, who's Kit Harington? Kit Harington is an actor, isn't he? Kit Brightling, this woman right here, is aligned to the sea. So she is called upon, she's the best at what she does. She's called upon by the Queen of this alternate England to retrieve someone who has been taken by some pirates. I won't tell you who they are, why they've been taken, or any of the, stuff. But it's just really lovely because this is a well-rounded person. I just really loved it. I loved it. She saves the day. Everything works out in the end. I don't think that that's going to be a spoiler. It's set up for another book. If this becomes a series, I will absolutely read every book in this series. I really felt attached to this character very quickly. And even though I really don't enjoy swashbuckling or pirates or battle scenes, I really loved this. It was like Master and Commander, only with magic and women. I loved it. And I do like Master and Commander. So maybe I don't hate adventures. I don't know what I like. I like what I like, and I don't like what I don't like. You're the same, I promise. I read something on my Kindle. Miss Rochester's Ghost on my Kindle. I don't read a lot of things on my Kindle, but I read Miss Rochester's Ghost on here, and I absolutely loved it. It was on Kindle Unlimited for free. It was a brand new release, and I saw that it had come out. It's a Jane Eyre retelling, and even though I was already reading Gemma Hardy and loving it, I decided to go ahead and get this one too because it was free. So, it was phenomenal. I absolutely loved it. I actually had a moment where I was sitting in my bed. It's a thriller, and it's current day. And I was sitting in my bed and I was reading it, and I was actually scared in the middle of the night. And I cannot remember the last time that happened. It is... Part of it is told through the perspective of the Jane Eyre character, and part of it is told through the perspective of the Bertha character, neither of which is named Jane or Bertha in Mrs. Rochester's Ghost. But it's a thriller, and it's really well done. Again, it's very different from the actual story, but there's, like, the author, you can tell the author knows Jane Eyre well enough, actually knows it very well, to be able to take the themes and the intent of the book and to make it their own, in their own story. It was phenomenal. It was out of this world phenomenal. I read it so quickly, and it was so beautiful. Yeah, highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. And it's a thriller, so maybe don't read it alone in bed at night. I mean, I had a moment where I was scared. It was so great. It was so great. I can't remember the last time that happened. Then I picked up this. So I picked up a bunch of 5 and 10 cent old mass market paperbacks from a library book sale in a town that I lived in, not too far from where I live now, before I moved away from that town. And this was one of them. And so I have them. I've since dropped some of them, thought, I picked this up, it was 10 cents, whatever, went to the library, that's great. I probably am never going to read this impulse buy. But I kept this one, and I read this one. I picked it up on an impulse when I bought it, and I picked it up on an impulse when I read it, and it was so much fun. Basic premise is this: our main character is a lawyer, and this is all in the beginning, none of this is spoilers. So she's a lawyer, and she has always been interested in Regency romances, and so she travels to England when her relationship with her lawyer, I don't know if he's her fiance, no, he's not her fiance, with her boyfriend, who is a partner in her firm. And he wants to marry her, not because he loves her, but because if she makes partner, they should get married and be more powerful in their firm. And so this is not her idea of love or romance. And so she dumps him and goes to England to have her own adventures there, right? She's got a plan, and she's going to see certain things. But on her first night there, she happens to see a gossip magazine, and there's a Viscount, a portrait of a Viscount who was apparently a bad boy of the Regency period. And she kind of becomes obsessed with him just from seeing that picture. So if you're not a fan of insta-love, it's not really insta-love at that moment, but insta-love does come. So just prepare yourself. But anyway, she kind of becomes obsessed with learning about this person. And then she starts seeing his residual ghost all over London. She decides to go and visit his ancestral home, because of course there's a tour for it. But she has to sign up for all these other to tour all these other homes. It's like a package deal. And so she spends days and days on a bus going from old ancestral home to old ancestral home until she finally gets to his, where she spots the portrait, and things just, get kind of weird as far as time goes from that moment forward. So there's time travel in this, and I've never read a time travel romance, but this was so fun. It was impossible. It was absolutely impossible. But this is a classic romance from the 1990s with a twist of Regency love and lots of time travel forwards and backwards. It is a romance, so of course everything is happy in the end, and it was just a perfect little bit of escapism. 3 stars. So for my travel, I read The Kingdom of Women, Life, Love, and Death in China's Hidden Mountains by Chu Wei Hong. This was beautiful. This is written by a corporate lawyer. There we go. This is written by a corporate lawyer who is of Chinese descent, and she ends up traveling to visit her mother's side of the family, kind of. She's not visiting any direct relations, but she knows her heritage, and so she's visiting this Musou tribe in the foothills of the Himalayas. They are, I'm reading from the back here, they are protected by the mountain goddess Gimu, and the tribe is inherently female in its ancestry, with every family headed by the grandmother, and each generation only connected by matrilineal bloodline. They choose their own lovers through the tradition of walking marriage. Children grow up with their mothers, siblings, and uncles to guide them. It is a feminist utopia that does exist today and now, and has for many hundreds of years. And you probably don't know it exists. I didn't know it existed. I picked this up because I've spent time in Tibet, and I have spent years living in the foothills of the Himalayas, but on the northern India side. And I have loved all of the wonderful things that are there that nobody knows about unless you've been there. And this is one of those things, and I wanted to know more. I absolutely love this. I chose to read Salisbury Hill by Susan M. Weiler because it is a retelling of Wuthering Heights, which is another one of my very favorite books of all time. And this was great. It's a 3-star. It's a solid 3-star because there are some very strange story choices here. The pacing is really weird. It does have a lot of the feel of Wuthering Heights, but it is not a retelling of Wuthering Heights. It tries to do what my retelling of Frankenstein, This Monstrous Thing, did, where it tries to put the creator and the creation together in the same world. Kind of. So we've got Emily Bronte in here, who wrote Wuthering Heights. We've got the characters of Wuthering Heights, and we've got the current day people who the story is really about, all residing within the same world here. And so it was a little bit confusing, a little bit weird, a little bit overcrowded. It was very much overcrowded. And she's a poet. This author is mainly a poet, and you can feel that. So I think that a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times when you have a person who is predominantly a poet or a lyricist try to tackle narrative fiction, it's beautiful, but it doesn't get a lot of traction storytelling wise. So the plot suffers. And that's definitely what this was. Like, there are some really beautiful excerpts that are completely pointless for the story. Completely pointless for the story. They have nothing to do with the actual story that's being told. But they're so pretty that I think she couldn't dare to take them out. Like, and I don't blame the author for that. I always point my finger at the editor, and I'm like, why wasn't there more persuasive editing going on here? Like that old adage about killing your darling. Given myself that mantra when I am going through my own writing. Like, why is this in here? Is it just because it's beautifully written? There's a lot of things that are beautifully written that have nothing to do with moving a narrative story forward. This is ultimately a narrative story, and there are huge chunks of it. It's not that big, and there's still huge chunks of it that were purposeless, but pretty. Read this. I made a whole video about this already. I read Evie Drake Starts Over. I read this because the librarian said, "Oh, you loved Second First Impressions? You'll love this." I did not. Vanessa Yu's Magic Paris Tea Shop. This was okay. This was 3 stars. This was fine. I felt very removed from it most of the time. It would have been a good airplane read. That's what it is. It's an airplane read for me. Read this because I love Dracula. At first I was so excited about this. I had my reservations because this is told in a series of like text messages and emails and diary entries, and yes, that is how the majority of Dracula is told. Not text messages, but like diary entries and letters. But I don't really like stories that work that way. I don't like that kind of storytelling device that much. I'd say like 50% of this is text message. But it was done so well. It was really, like, that part of this book was so excellently done. It felt like I was reading conversations from people I know. It was awesome. Loved it. Then it started to get really like, well, also I thought it was YA. It is not YA. It started to get really steamy, very, very, very steamy for no reason. And yes, seduction is part of Dracula, but this was gratuitous and excessive. And it just got more and more and more and more as the book went on. And so it wasn't what I thought I was getting. I thought I was getting a YA retelling of Dracula, but what I was really getting was a really steamy romance novel told through text messaging with some creepy people in it. And then the story, so I was forgiving it all of that because the writing was really excellent. So I kept going. And then the reveal, I'll call it the reveal, was so incredibly ridiculous. I felt like I had wasted many, many, many hours of my precious life. That this book, in fact, was a vampire that had sucked the life out of me. 2-star reads. Lives in Ruins. I was so excited for this one because it was about the detritus of human lives, but it wasn't really. It was about experiences that this author has had on different archaeological digs and the kinds of people that she has met along the way. This one. I read this because it was recommended to me by the librarian because I loved A Town Like Alice by Neville Shute. And this was absolutely nothing like that book. But it does have the same setting, except for Australia. So it's set in Malaysia, and it's set in England and Hong Kong. But this story is about infidelity and imperialism and lost opportunities and kind of giving up, whereas A Town Like Alice was really hopeful and the characters were good people. I know that's a hard thing to characterize people as good or not good, but they had vision and they had as altruistic of a motive for being alive as any human can have, whereas these characters all had ulterior motives for everything they did. Sad that I read this book. This book made me feel sad, but also kind of depressed because it was really hopeless. This book was really hopeless. This book is like a void. I did not like it. And to think of the name, Old Filth, his name is not Filth, his last name is actually Feathers, but Filth is an acronym. It's an acronym for Failed in London, Try Hong Kong. So he's named for not being able to succeed in society in London, so he goes to succeed in society in Hong Kong. I just hated everything about this book. White magic. So I wrote a long review about this one. I gave this 2 stars. I think it might deserve 3 stars, but I read this because the librarian recommended it, because I told the librarian that I loved The Witch of Ai, which is a series of essays about each one about a different woman and one man who'd been accused of witchcraft in history and what they'd been accused of and the circumstances and who had accused them. And then she takes all of this and she uses it as a lens through which to view women who accuse men of raping them and how society treats them in our day and age, as well as weaving in her own memoir. And it's so beautiful and so masterfully done, and every word carries so much weight. It's about a fourth the length of this book and says about 200 times more than this book does. I had really high hopes for this book, which is why I think it might deserve 3 stars, and I gave it 2. I might have been being really hard on this book, but I am not feeling like I'm not feeling like my harshness was misplaced. I think it's justified. But I just might have felt it a little too hard because I wanted more. This is a local author. Well, they're from a local tribe. And they were writing about all the same things as The Witch of Ai. All of them. Except that this one is written by not age-wise, but experience-wise and skill level-wise by an adolescent essayist. It is not... The author of this book has not come to any conclusions or learned any lessons these essays are in fact them trying to untangle the experiences of their life. Whereas The Witch of Eye has done all of the untangling and is now talking you through that process, has come to some conclusions, has wisdom to offer. This has questions and judgment and anger. There's so much anger. There's anger in The Witch of Eye too, and it's justified in both books. Both essayists are justified in their anger, but one is a productive anger and one is a self-destroying anger. One was inspiring to read and one was deflating to read. So I get why this was suggested, but I would not read this again. The Spring Girls. I chose to read this because it was a retelling of Little Women. It's a very straight up retelling of Little Women, except that near the end, the author gets real excited to completely change the outcomes of everybody's life. And so you lose the power of the original story, which is this author's prerogative, and that's totally fine. And I'm sure that there are some people who would be super excited to have a happy ending. I think Little Women already has a happy ending, but some people don't. I mean, characters die, and characters marry the wrong characters, and characters make weird life choices. I think everything's as it should be. This one is like, let me be very clear about completely retelling the story set on an army base in our current, contemporary world, and then let me just randomly change everything all of a sudden. So it was very fan fiction-y. It was extremely fan fiction-y. And I actually had 2 one-star reads this month. It was Blue Ticket, and this was another one that I got from Book Outlet to fill a cart. It sounded so interesting. It's a dystopian society in the future where females, the female of the species, is raised and monitored very closely, observed very closely. And when they reach puberty, they receive a ticket. If it's a white ticket, then they're going to kind of be the breeders. They're going to be the mothers. They're going to have children. They're going to get married and live lives and things, but they're going to have children. And if you've been observed to not have a mothering instinct or that caring capacity, then you're going to get a blue ticket and you're going to enter the workforce and you're going to not be able to have children, and you're going to be kind of promiscuous and have fun, but mostly you're going to work. And so our main character receives a blue ticket, and I knew all of this. This is what I knew going into it. But what I didn't know was how stark this book would be and how kind of terrifying it would become. It went too far for me. I still think the premise of the book is very interesting, but I didn't like the execution of the story. And my last book for the month was one-star read. That is Brother of the More Famous Jack. What a great title. I love that title so much, and I love this cover so much, and I hated this book so much. I read this because it was recommended to me as one of the 3 books that I chose to read because of my love of Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day, and this book was awful. It was really, really negative. So many of the books that I said I loved because they were lighthearted and optimistic. And so many of the books that were suggested for me to read because I loved those lighthearted and optimistic books were pessimistic and negative. It's interesting to me that is how that's how the suggestions were interpreted. I almost feel like it was purposeful. I almost feel like the librarian was trying to counteract how much I loved the positivity and the lightheartedness of the books that I chose, because so many of the books that were suggested for me sounded very positive and were pitched to me in a very positive manner, but when I read them, were painfully pessimistic about humanity. This was painfully pessimistic about humanity. No! This is the story of a young girl who doesn't get along with her single mother, who gets invited kind of into a found family of people who take advantage of her physically and emotionally. And she gets pulled into this weird dynamic where her much older than her boyfriend is friends with her professor, and also flirting with her professor's wife, who becomes like her mother, and how she kind of grows up in this. And then she leaves, then she comes back and she marries another family member in that found family. It's just yucky. The entire thing was not okay. On top of all of that, the writing is incredibly pretentious. So, all in all, my month off in August was very refreshing. I know that I had like a huge range of enjoyment, from these off the charts 5 stars to these, whoa, that was so gross, I'm sad I read that, 2 and 1 stars. But I loved it. I loved finding these books that I hated. I loved the librarian recommendations, not necessarily because they worked every time. When they worked so well. Miss Hargreaves, oh my goodness, I never would have found that book. But now it's one of my favorite books of all time. So like, I loved librarian recommendation. I loved picking up the book and going, ooh, I was told I was gonna like this. I wonder if I really will like this. So I think I want to do it again. I think I want in the future to have the librarian recommend some books to me again. So maybe I'll do that once a year from now on. I don't know. I really enjoyed it. And I really liked picking books to read that were retellings of some of my favorites, or books that maybe weren't retellings, but I kept using that phrase, a nod, like give a nod towards some of my favorites. That was really fun for me. And I found a lot of new favorite books. I really did. I also found a lot of books that I absolutely hated. No DNFs though. No DNFs. So that's a positive. I almost DNF'd Brother of the More Famous Jack. I really did. Multiple times. But I kept thinking, maybe it'll change. Maybe it'll change. That was the other thing. Like, that was my mantra through all of these librarian reads, was maybe it'll change. It never changed. But that's okay. September, then we'll have Victober and scary reads, nonfiction November, and like warm family reads, Christmas and winter books for December, and the year is done. How is that possible? I don't know. I'll see you around. Happy reading!